Welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Singularity, where humanity never backs down. Subscribe, and let the story begin. The ruins of Kathrani 9 had been sitting on that dead little moon for approximately 11,000 years, minding their own business, when the first alien scholar showed up with a notepad and main character energy. That was 230 years ago. Since then, 4 different galactic civilizations had sent their brightest minds to stare at the walls, and every single one of them had walked away with the same conclusion: nope. Not "we're close." Not "give us another decade." Just a flat, cosmic nope. The symbols carved into the black stone were elegant, spiral things, arranged in patterns that shifted depending on the angle you looked at them, which honestly should have been everyone's first clue that something annoying was going on. Entire academic careers had been built and then quietly euthanized trying to crack them. Supercomputers that could model the collapse of stars choked on this script like it was a chicken bone. The Zenari Empire had once dedicated an entire moon-sized processing array to the problem for 6 years straight, and the array's final output, after all that power and all that time, was a single error message that translated roughly to, "I would rather not." Relatable, honestly. So by the time the Confederated Archive Council decided to let a 5th species take a crack at it, nobody expected much. The humans hadn't even been part of galactic society for a full generation yet. They were the new kids at the intergalactic lunch table, the ones still figuring out which fork to use, and the council only agreed to let them send a team because refusing would have been, in the delicate language of interspecies diplomacy, kind of a dick move. Nobody thought the humans would solve anything. They just didn't want to be rude about it. Overseeing the whole operation was a Velcrian scholar named Ostuan Rel, who had personally spent 194 years of his 300-year lifespan on this exact problem, which meant he had devoted roughly 2/3 of his conscious existence to a wall that would not talk to him. He wore his frustration the way some species wear medals, visibly, proudly, and slightly too tight. Beside him stood Commander Vashti Kaur, a Dravak military escort whose actual job was to make sure nobody blew up the ruins, and whose secondary, entirely unofficial job was rolling her eyes at academics. She had the demeanor of someone who had been assigned babysitting duty and resented every second of it, mostly because the last research team had tried to lick one of the walls to test its mineral composition. Scientists, she'd concluded, could not be trusted with anything. And overseeing the budget, because nothing in the galaxy happens without someone overseeing the budget, was a council bureaucrat named Pfennig Thuros, whose species communicated stress through a faint, high-pitched whistle that got louder the angrier he became. Pfennig had approved the human team's travel expenses under protest and had already drafted, in advance, the report explaining why this had been a waste of resources. "They'll poke around for a week, take some pictures, and go home confused," Pfennig had said, whistling softly. Like everyone else. Ostuan had nodded in solemn agreement, because 200 years of failure does something to a person's expectations. He'd stopped hoping for a breakthrough sometime around year 80. Now he just hoped for company in his misery. The human team turned out to be one person. One. Pfennig's whistle nearly shattered a window when the shuttle doors opened and out walked a single unimpressed human named Dax Okonkwo Reyes, wearing a jacket that had clearly seen better decades, carrying a bag that appeared to contain snacks and possibly nothing else of scientific value. "Where's the rest of your team?" Ostuan asked, in the tone of someone bracing for disappointment. "This is the team," Dax said, looking around at the ruins with the mild interest of a man checking out a mildly interesting parking garage. "Budget cuts. Also, honestly, nobody else wanted to fly 6 months for a wall." Vashti crossed her arms. "You understand this site has resisted analysis from 4 major civilizations." "Sure," Dax said, already walking toward the entrance without waiting for an escort, which made Vashti's eye twitch. "Walls are tough. I've met a few." Pfennig's whistle climbed an octave. "This is who they sent. This is the representative of an entire species." "Look, man," Dax called back over his shoulder, "I didn't send myself. My university did. I think mostly because I was the only one in the linguistics department who said yes without asking follow-up questions. Ostuan found himself, against every instinct built over 2 centuries of academic dignity, kind of liking this guy already. The tour of the ruins took the better part of a day, mostly because Ostuan insisted on explaining, in exhaustive detail, every failed theory the Council had produced over 2 centuries. There was the resonance theory, which claimed the symbols were meant to be sung rather than read, and which had produced 11 years of increasingly unhinged alien opera before being abandoned. There was the fractal consciousness theory, which suggested the symbols could only be understood by minds capable of holding 4 contradictory thoughts simultaneously, which, frankly, ruled out most of the galaxy including several of its most advanced supercomputers. There was the deeply embarrassing prank theory, floated briefly by a junior researcher, suggesting the whole thing might just be ancient graffiti, a theory that got him removed from the project so fast his desk was still warm when the next scholar sat down. Dax listened to all of this while eating something crunchy out of a bag, nodding along politely, the way you nod when someone's explaining their elaborate conspiracy theory about the office microwave. And the symbols shift, Ostuan said, gesturing grandly at the central wall, depending on the viewing angle. We believe this indicates a form of multidimensional encoding beyond our current mathematical frameworks. Dax tilted his head, squinted at the wall, then tilted it back the other way. Huh, he said. Yeah, that's just parallax. Ostuan blinked. I'm sorry. It's parallax. The carvings are cut at layered depths, so different angles reveal different strokes. It's not encoding, it's just, Dax made a little visual gesture with his hand, like flipping through a lenticular postcard. You know those cards where the image changes when you tilt them? Like a hologram sticker on a cereal box? It's that. Just very fancy, very old-school analog. The whistling from Fennec briefly stopped entirely, which Vashti would later describe as more alarming than when it was loud. That does not explain the linguistic structure, Ostuan said, a little defensively now, because 200 years is a long time to be wrong quietly and an even longer time to be wrong loudly in front of a stranger eating chips. No, Dax agreed. That's a separate problem. Can I get closer to the main panel? This was the moment, later recounted approximately 4 billion times across several star systems, that would end up in textbooks, bar arguments, and at least one deeply confused opera. Dax walked up to the central wall, the one wall nobody had ever fully translated, the one wall that had broken Zenari supercomputers and consumed Ostuan's entire adult life, and looked at it. Just looked at it. For about 40 seconds. Vashti actually checked her sidearm's charge, not because she expected danger, but because the silence was making her nervous and it gave her hands something to do. Okay, Dax said finally, around a mouthful of chips. So this top section here is basically a warning label. Like, standard hazard marker stuff, the repeating triangle motif, see how it shows up 3 separate times at the start of each block. That's not decorative. In a lot of early human scripts, you get the same thing, repetition at the head of a passage to flag, important, pay attention, don't skip this part. Think of it like all caps. Or a stop sign. You cannot possibly have, Ostuan started. And this middle section is a numbered sequence, Dax continued, ignoring him, tracing a finger just above the surface. The spiral pattern isn't mystical, it's just how they wrote left to right when their reading medium was circular tablets instead of flat pages. Once you assume it's meant to be read outward from the center instead of top to bottom, the whole, shifting with angle, thing stops being a puzzle and starts being, like, formatting. It's basically a legal document with bad kerning. Fennec had gone entirely silent, whistle and all, which several nearby birds found deeply unsettling. How, Ostuan said, each word arriving separately, like they were afraid to be seen together, are you doing this? Dax shrugged. Honestly? I fill out tax forms for a living on the side. I have translated my grandmother's texts, which use 4 languages in one sentence and at least one made-up word per paragraph. I have read teenage internet slang in real time during a family group chat. This is, comparatively, extremely chill. You guys just weren't reading it as writing. You were reading it as a mystery, so you kept looking for something profound. Sometimes it's not profound. Sometimes it's just badly formatted. The full translation took another 2 hours, mostly because Dax kept stopping to ask Ostruan clarifying questions about local astronomical terms, and once to ask if anyone had a snack that wasn't shaped like a chip, because his hands were getting greasy and he didn't want to touch 11,000-year-old stonework with barbecue dust on his fingers. What the wall said, when it was finally laid out in full, was this. It was not a prophecy. It was not a cosmic warning about the end of civilizations. It was not, despite 2 centuries of increasingly desperate speculation, a message from some transcendent precursor intelligence about the fate of the universe. It was a decommissioning notice. The ruins of Kathrani 9 had been, 11,000 years ago, a waste processing and containment facility, extremely mundane, extremely bureaucratic, built by a civilization that predated all 4 of the species currently standing around arguing about it. The elaborate hazard triangles were, in fact, hazard triangles, warning about a containment breach that had happened and been resolved roughly 10,980 years ago. The forbidden symbols everyone had spent careers agonizing over were, essentially, an ancient OSHA report, complete with a formal apology to future visitors for the site's poor structural maintenance and a note that liability for any resulting injury was not assumed by the facility's operating authority, which is also, as of this writing, bankrupt. The site wasn't sacred. It wasn't cursed. It was a decommissioned industrial facility, and its forbidden reputation had apparently spiraled out of an early mistranslation of one glyph, 2 centuries ago, that had rendered authorized personnel only, as those who are worthy shall not proceed, which, in retrospect, everyone agreed was an extremely embarrassing typo to build an entire religious mystique on top of. So nobody's meant to die here, Dax summarized, wiping his hands on his jacket. Nobody's meant to have a spiritual awakening here. It's a warehouse. A really old, structurally concerning warehouse, with a strongly worded sign. Ostruan sat down. Not dramatically, he just sort of folded, the way a very tall building might fold if you removed the right support beam, settling onto a nearby stone slab with the expression of a man recalculating the value of 200 years. I dedicated my entire adult life, he said quietly, to a maintenance memo. To be fair, Dax offered, it's a really well-preserved maintenance memo. I wrote 3 books. Were they good books? They won awards. Then it wasn't wasted, Dax said, with the easy generosity of someone who had never once written a book and therefore had nothing personally at stake in the conversation. Pfennig, meanwhile, had found his whistle again and was using it liberally, pacing in tight circles while muttering budget projections. 2 centuries. 2 centuries of council funding. Do you understand what I have to write in this report? Do you understand what my supervisor is going to say? My supervisor's supervisor is going to want a meeting. You could just say a human solved it in an afternoon, Dax offered, unhelpfully. That's true. That fits in a sentence. Pfennig's whistle hit a pitch that made a nearby support strut hum in sympathy. Vashti, for her part, was the only one who seemed to be enjoying herself, arms still crossed, watching 2 centuries of institutional pride quietly implode in real time. I'm going to be telling this story for the rest of my career, she said. Please don't, Ostruan said, from somewhere near the floor. By the time the shuttle back to the human settlement was ready, Ostruan had recovered enough dignity to at least stand upright, though something in his posture had permanently changed, the way a tree looks different after a storm even once it stopped bending. I would like to understand, he said to Dax, with the careful formality of someone trying very hard to salvage some intellectual pride from the wreckage, how a species so new to galactic civilization managed what 4 established civilizations could not. Dax thought about it for a second, actually thought about it, which Ostruan appreciated more than he expected to. Honestly? I think it's because you all kept assuming the answer had to be as impressive as the effort you put in, Dax said. 200 years of work feels like it should unlock something huge. But sometimes the universe just doesn't owe you a payoff proportional to your suffering. Humans are annoyingly used to that. Most of our own history is just people working really hard on things that turn out to be embarrassingly small once you translate them. Ancient tax records. Shopping lists carved in clay because somebody didn't want to forget the barley. We've got a whole field of study around old human writing that turned out to just be someone complaining about their neighbor's goat. You get used to it. You stop expecting prophecy and start expecting paperwork. Ostuan was quiet for a moment. That is, he said slowly, a profoundly unglamorous way to view the universe. Yeah, Dax agreed, shouldering his bag. But it's usually right. Word of what had happened on Kathrani 9 moved through the Confederated Archive Council with the particular speed reserved for stories that are both scientifically significant and extremely funny at someone else's expense. Within a month, it had reached every major species in the Confederation. Within 3, it had become the go-to example in first contact briefings across a dozen systems, filed under a heading that made several career diplomats wince every time they had to say it out loud: Notes on Human Problem Solving, Managing Expectations. The official council report, which Fennig drafted, redrafted, and drafted a third time under increasing supervisory pressure, ultimately used the phrase expedited resolution through unconventional methodology, which was, everyone agreed, an extremely diplomatic way of saying one guy ate chips at a wall and solved it before lunch. Ostuan, to his credit, went on to write a 4th book, this one considerably shorter than the first 3, about the experience of being professionally humbled by a species that had been part of galactic society for approximately 5 minutes. It also won an award, which he found almost funnier than the whole ordeal itself. As for Dax, he went home, got paid a modest consulting fee that he later admitted was honestly kind of insulting given the historical significance, and mostly just told the story at parties for the rest of his life, usually ending with the same line, delivered with the same easy shrug every time. Turns out the universe's biggest mysteries are usually just somebody's old paperwork nobody bothered to file correctly. Ancient aliens, modern government, doesn't matter. Read the fine print. Works every time. 6 months later, the council contacted him again. A second site had turned up, different star system, similarly ominous reputation, similarly untranslatable script that had stumped 3 separate research teams for over a decade. Dax read the briefing, sighed, and packed a bigger bag of chips. Let me guess, he said to the empty room, before boarding the shuttle. Another warehouse. He was right.